But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance on RUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Today's show, we are going to be talking about labor, in particular the gilding of labor. What happened from the time that workers began to get together to demand rights until today. And we are going to start with a quote.
All right. The quote actually is from the preamble of the Constitution of the the Industrial Workers of the World. And their preamble states, part of it, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Between these two, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the earth and the machinery of production, and abolish the wage system. That's from their preamble. And
another quote that we would like to bring to you today is from Joe Hill, who was a member of the International Industrial Workers of the World Party and a labor agitator, a songwriter, and more. If the workers take a notion, they can stop all speeding trains. Every ship upon the ocean they can tie with mighty chains. Every wheel in the creation, every mine and every mill, fleets and armies of the nation will at their command stand still.
The point behind this is really, for me, it was the expression of who really has power. You know, we like to think that the bosses have power because they have the authority to fire or hire or whatever. But the real power rests within the worker. All of us, no matter where you are in the world, that's where the real power lies. Because all those things are true. If the working people decided in mass that they're going to put an end to something, they will do it. They could put an end to war.
Absolutely.
Just stop the armies, as I said, stop the navies. They could take over the means of production and actually change the whole face and future of the world.
And before we start, I would like to introduce Phoenix Godwin, who is our guest on the show today. He'll be joining us in the discussion. And a big thanks to Savannah Patterson, who is running the board for us today, so that we can focus.
Bored.
She is not bored. She is excited to be running the board, and she's doing a great job. Thank you, Savannah. So on today's show, we started with some quotes from the 1800s, kind of revolutionary quotes from some labor leaders. And yet we contrast that to today. It's very doubtful we would hear words like that today coming out of the mouths of our labor leaders. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll take that one.
Okay.
I've always been a great supporter of unions. I was a member of unions, and if you're a working person, you almost have to have a union. But the union is the people, not just the bosses. And what that became apparent at one of our strikes in Seattle at one time. It was part of the hotel and restaurant servers union there. And the power they had was that they had the power to provide jobs.
Right.
It didn't come from anyone else. They had the list. You went to the union. They gave you this 120 restaurants in downtown Seattle. You could go to any of them, and you could get a job there. I went back many years later after McDonald's had come in and broken the unions downtown, and they gave me a list of about 15. That's
Wow.
what was left.
And
So
yet,
there's power in
yes, there
people
can be
uniting
power in the
together for any
unions, and yet
cause.
today we know that the rate of unionized workers is the lowest it's been since we had organized unions, and that rate has been declining since 1983. Today, only 10.7% of all workers in this country are unionized, and that's down from 20% in 1983. We also
And
know
from 35 in the 50s.
and 35 back when the unions were very strong, very active, and workers recognized the value of the unions because of the working conditions that they were working under. So as union membership has gone down, we know that middle-class incomes have steadily fallen from 53% to 47% of all income in the United States. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're one of those people who has seen your income decline because you are now working at a job that's paying less than what it had been paying, or a different job, or you've lost your job, you will understand all too well what that means to you.
Also, if you look at the graph itself, it parallels the drop in union.
Yes.
The middle class just goes downhill almost exactly, spot by spot. No high spots, no low spots. It's
Right.
a good parallel.
And today we're going to talk about the unions, a little bit of a history of the unions when they were at their peak, and then their steady decline. We're going to ask some questions. We hope that perhaps you will join in the conversation by going to our Facebook page and sending us messages and being part of the show, and give us your ideas as we try to grapple with what happened to the unions, what happened to the good paying jobs that made it possible for people to have a decent standard of living. We know that in many states there were right-to-work laws that were enacted that certainly made it difficult for unions to attract members. So right-to-work laws are now statutes in 28 of the 50 states, and basically what they say is that if you work in a union shop, if you work in a shop where there's a union present, you are not required to pay union dues and join the union, but you will get all the benefits that a union has fought for.
Part of the things with the right to work is the states in the North that you think of as strong bastions of the labor movement are now turning, if they haven't already, into right-to-work states. Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan. These are great union strongholds for many, many years. Minnesota, and now they're shadows of themselves. At one time, they right to work, and the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker,
Right.
did a very good job. The unions tried to fight him, and they had got the numbers out for the demonstrations when he was trying to take over cities and that sort of thing. But when it came down to the vote, many of the union members voted for Scott Walker, which makes no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Makes no sense.
Especially considering the large protests they were having.
It was monstrous, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
Yes.
It was really warming.
It was
the
right
heart.
before Occupy. It was sort
Yeah.
of like almost a predecessor. I think it helped inspire a lot of people to occupy a space because they did the city hall there. They occupied it heavily, even with the fire departments and all the teachers, a lot of people.
Banner drops, the whole thing. They did a lot.
Can you say more about the what the right to work actually means? Because I know that it's also something that allows people to get fired pretty easily. It's something that has one of those ironic and somewhat misleading names, and I think a lot of people think of it as something particularly good when the actual basis of what the laws represent does not necessarily help workers or their right to work.
The right to work is not designed to help a worker at all. It's designed to help the corporation, number one, or the company. Because the right to work means that basically they can hire you, fire you anytime they wish. There's not much you can do about it. And even here in Georgia, they don't like the shirt you're wearing that day, you can be fired. Lifestyle, beard, it makes no difference. If they so choose, they can get rid of you because this is a right to work. Who's going to stand up for you? There's no union or anyone else. And certainly the others that you work with are in fear of losing their job. So they certainly aren't going to stand with you. So without that strong presence of a union united together, you have no hope. The one thing is it also ensures low wages. We have become a third world country almost now with the wage system because companies from IKEA to some of the Japanese plants are coming here because the labor is cheaper here than it is in Japan or in Sweden or wherever they are. So, yeah, so the right to work is very destructive for the working people, but it's great for a company.
And not surprisingly, all of the southern states are right-to-work states, including Georgia. And the question that was just asked about hiring and firing is a good question. And I would encourage anybody who works for a unionized company to let us know what that means, because there is a union. There is a union that represents all the employees, whether you join or not. However, because you're not compelled to join, perhaps the unions aren't quite as strong as they used to be in guaranteeing certain rights. It used to be in a union shop, if you were fired, the union would give you counsel to protest if you felt the firing was unfair. And that may or may not be the case now that unions have been so weakened. The other thing that we know is that most union membership these days, and probably not surprisingly, are public sector workers, education, training, and library workers. And there's so little industry left in this country, that's not a surprising thing.
Yeah, there's really something that bothers me, though, about the right to work. The fact that union members pay dues.
Right.
And paying those dues gives a union operating fund so they can provide the services that need to be provided. Someone who comes in who is non-union doesn't want to join the union. They don't pay those dues. So it costs them technically nothing.
Right.
But whenever the time comes for the union to negotiate contracts, they benefit equally.
That's right.
With those who have sweated or who have worked with the union. So it seems like either pay all or no one pays. I mean, it just doesn't seem fair that they can benefit. Now, I would like to see it if you're not a member of the union, you don't get that raise. You know, you go at the mercy of the company.
That's right.
But it doesn't work that way.
It seems incredibly
So
unfair.
unions still technically have to fight for everyone, even though the chances of winning without the numbers behind him is very slim.
That's an awfully subversive tactic to battle that. That's
right.
Because it sounds like it might be good because it could help some people, but then when you realize the drastic effect it has on the ability for workers to empower themselves, it's, well, subversive and really horrible.
And it depends on how you think about things and society in which you live. The individual, my right to work. Well, we all have a right to work. We should be guaranteed a job. That's an employment, period. But in this instance, it means it's my right alone. And if it has an adverse effect on someone else or the place where I am working, tough, because we are individuals in this country. We're not thinking about everyone working together and really being a community or being a family. That's the one thing about the unions is that they were always family. You know?
Yes.
And that was the one thing you heard, we're a family.
And as we carry on this conversation, we'll be talking in particular about one union that not only looked out for the benefits of its workers, but looked beyond that to the community, for the welfare and the benefit of the community. So we thought we would start with a brief, we hope brief, history of unionism in this country, which is anything but brief.
It is not brief, I promise you. We've spent 3 days and we haven't even touched half
That's
of
right.
it.
We feel like we have written an entire curriculum for a college course in the past 3 days, but you won't get it all today. So,
send us your email or something asking for it, and we'll send it to you.
Yes, we can send you a copy
apply
of our
for
outline.
college credit.
So the history of the labor movement in the U.S. can be best defined as class warfare between the capitalist captains of industry, the owner class, and workers. many of whom were new, non-English speaking immigrants from the end of the 18th, and this went from the 18th century to today. A history of owners exploiting workers, workers organizing and bargaining or fighting back. Sadly, it's also a history of warfare between worker organizations, many of which, as we talked about earlier, they shared the same values, but it was clearly their strategy and tactics where they differed, and this created great divides between the organizations representing workers. So one of the things we're having this conversation because we'll be celebrating Labor Day in, I guess it's 5 days. And there's always conversation about Labor Day. How did it start? Why did it start? And why in the U.S. do we celebrate labor on the first Monday after the first Sunday in September rather than May Day, which is International Workers' Day? So when we did a little history, we discovered that May Day actually came from the original pagan May Day celebration, but it wasn't necessarily received well in this country, particularly by the Puritans, because May Day was a very free-for-all, free-flowing, free-love kind of a day, and certainly the likes of Cotton Mather weren't too happy with that, were they?
No, he didn't like that at all. And it was basically something similar to a very raucous St. Patrick's Day here, combined with Mardi Gras and anything you can think
all
of
of
goes.
the
It usually
I might
did.
not like it either.
Oh, I'm there. I'm there.
I love May
there.
Day. And as you all do your Labor Day thing this coming weekend, picnics, parades, beach, whatever it is you do, I hope you'll think about some of what you're going to hear on the show today, where labor was, where labor is, and how we perhaps can go back to that revolutionary spirit that would help us all, workers and communities. So for the first half of the beginnings of this country, not unexpectedly, not surprisingly, I'm sure for many of you, it were the landed gentry who really set the agenda for this country. The captains of industry, they got charters to incorporate from their states. They got all sorts of benefits. They created situations of boom and bust, which just didn't necessarily, certainly the booms were good for the workers because everyone was employed, but not necessarily employed at good wages.
So what has changed?
So what has changed? That's right. So what has changed? All these years, we're going to talk about labor organizations. We're going to talk about the labor movement, but what has changed?
Yeah, the action. I don't think anything. It sounded like you could say that about today for the most part.
That's right. You are exactly right. And one of the things we'd like to think that perhaps if labor had been able to maintain its radical strategies, perhaps things could have changed. But we'll talk about that too. Businesses were able to create monopolies. There were antitrust laws that were incredibly ineffective. In fact, Cornelius Vanderbilt, when asked about antitrust laws, said, "Law, what do I care about law? Hain't I got the power?" So power set the agenda. Money set the agenda. After 1870 in this country, the pace of industrial development skyrocketed, as we know, the Industrial Revolution. We had the likes of Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, oil, railroads. Yes. Yeah. And there were a lot of pro-business laws that continued to be developed. In fact, the Homestead Act, which sounds like a great act that would enable, ordinary people to get land to homestead, was actually an act that enabled people with a lot of money to go out and buy very large tracts of land while the country gave free land to the railroads. Poor people were not part of the mix. They didn't benefit from that. Also, there was the establishment of a national bank. There was this thing called the Contract Labor Law of 1864 that enabled foreign workers to pledge 12 months of wages to pay the costs of emigrating to the U.S. And the reality was that when there were strikes, these workers were used as scabs during the strikes because they had signed contracts.
We had all the immigrants coming from Ireland and from the Balkan states and all, and that's exactly what they were.
Right.
You know, the Irish especially. We were shipped off to Mexico, that sort of thing, to fight a war that we knew nothing about, and we
Right.
get down there and decide, hey, we're on the wrong side. And so we started supporting the Mexican position, rather deserted, you might say.
But not surprisingly, trade unions also began to form in response to the acts of the business owners imposing harsh working conditions, unfair labor practices. I mean, many of us are learned in our history books about the shirtwaist factory fire, those kinds of things. And in fact, the first strike in this country was in 1677. It was the New York City carter strike. And those were the cart drivers who went on strike. And in 1746, there was a carpenters' union strike in Savannah. And it's known because it was the first time workers were actually prosecuted for going on strike.
Now, I found that, and I have tried my best to go as far as I can to find the sources of it to prove it. Apparently, it wasn't picked up on Google, which has everything, so
Right.
I'm questioning now. But if anyone has any information on it or anything at all, please let us know, because if it was the first actual strike at which the strikers were legally punished by law, and it was 1746, Savannah was, 13 years old?
Right.
And
right.
carpenters were very important in Savannah in those days.
In fact, it was before the Revolution. So,
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So
30 years.
we would like very much to know about that. In 1829, an individual named George Henry Evans did this Working Man's Declaration of Independence, a pro-labor stance on taxes, working conditions, and there were many other such actions both before the Civil War, but then particularly after that war of Northern aggression, was it?
It was a bad war.
It was a bad war.
That's all you
All
need to
war's a
say,
bad
yeah.
war, but
All
that was a
wars are
bad war.
bad, yes.
Agreed. Okay.
No good ones.
So the labor movement did pick up considerably after 1865.
But you're in something there. This is all because of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
It's not because of working people necessarily. There's always been working people, but this
Right.
is in response to a specific thing. And then remember, in 1848, it was addressed by Karl Marx.
Right. He talked about
Yep.
alienation from their labor. Essentially, people were working on making things that they couldn't afford to buy, which caused a lot of civil unrest for obvious reasons. And probably is still doing that again here. We see that here. It seems like a lot of people are working pretty hard for wages that don't actually allow them to live.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, not only for the wages that don't allow them to live, but the threat, all that hangs over the head all the time about losing the job.
Right.
You know, they can demand anything, and you will almost bend over backwards to do it because you cannot afford to lose your job. That's a big thing now. I can't protest, or I can't do this because I might lose my job. How am I going to feed my family if I don't have a job?
That's right. That's absolutely right. So one of the things that workers realized as the country was industrializing and these, captains of industry were amassing more and more wealth, and wealth meant power, and power meant you could impose working conditions on your workers without any penalties at all, was that individuals trying to negotiate with these captains of industry were much weaker than if they negotiated as a group. And a number of different groups were formed, became the first labor unions. Probably the most well-known was the Knights of Labor, that was created in 1869. And
1869, sorry.
1869?
Yeah.
Oh, did I say 15?
Yeah.
Okay, 1869. Sorry about that. And continued through the 1940s. A very significant union that started in Pittsburgh in 1881 was the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. Now, this was a group that brought together members of a lot of other groups and held a very important convention in Chicago in 1884. And at that convention, they called for an 8-hour workday, which at the time was quite radical because there were no laws that governed workdays. Many people worked many hours.
Which convention was this?
This was the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, Chicago Convention in 1884, and they had a proclamation that said that on or after May 1st, 1886, the 8-hour day, 8 hours shall constitute a legal day's labor. That was their demand.
And they actually brought together all the unions
Yes.
available at the time. So they always didn't agree on everything. But on this one, they did. And, of course, 1886, they had their big to-do, which, from the Haymarket.
That's
was
right.
part of that. So.
Well, the anarchists they had decided at this point that they were going, and the anarchists/communists decided that they were going to be involved with the labor movement,
Absolutely.
specifically put their efforts towards aiding the fight for the 8-hour workday at this point as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of solidarity in that effort to get the 8-hour day, and workers were asked to take a day off from their job and to come out into the streets and to join this effort. 300,000 people throughout the country did that, 40,000 people in Chicago, and they literally shut the city down.
See, that's the power of the union we were talking about at first. I've often wondered, the unions today are emasculated. They are gelded. They can't use their power. They can't muster the power. There's too many laws against them. They've given up so many benefits and so many rights. They have no place to go now, hardly. So when something happens that further puts the worker in danger, they draft some sort of statement. They often head to Atlanta or wherever it is so they can talk to their favorite congressman, Democratic congressman 9 times out of 10. And try and convince him to please don't let them do this to us. We're good. We're working hard, and please, sir, don't let this happen. And of course, the politician listens and pats them on the back as they leave, and I'm on your side. And then next thing you know, they've lost again.
That's
and
right.
they keep doing this. They keep doing this. When their real power is, if they wanted to, they could shut down Atlanta. They could shut down D.C., New York, Chicago. They shut down the shipping on the East Coast, the West Coast. That's the power of the working man.
That's right. But of course, what they do today is very low-risk activity, as compared to this 1886 action that
Beware the
actually
ants.
3 days later resulted in what's called the Haymarket Massacre. Somehow there was an explosion, and
Wait, I just want to point
Yeah.
out, there was the action first before the rally at Haymarket Square
Right.
with the bomb. There was the larger action that
yes.
involved the massacre itself was when police fired into the crowd because a fight broke out, and so police were shooting. People
Right.
were shooting at the police. Police were shooting at other police, and just people were all shooting at each other, and it was crazy.
Absolutely.
And then they had the Haymarket Square rally, and you can go on with that.
right.
Then they had
No,
an
that's
explosion.
very
Boom.
true. That's very true. And the fact that people were willing to come out into the streets, knowing that there were risks involved, knowing that they may not come home at the end of the day, is very different than getting on a bus and going to Atlanta for the day to talk to your legislators. Absolutely.
Yeah, the biggest thing you might miss there is lunch.
Right.
Well, yeah, you might miss your lunch, but, you were likely to come home unless you missed your bus, and then maybe you wouldn't come home.
As we did once.
Yes. So from this Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions came an organization that I'm sure sounds familiar to most of you now, the American Federation of Labor. And we will certainly talk a little bit more about them.
That's the famous AFL of the group called AFL-CIO.
Yes, and this was called a craft union, a craft trades union, because the AFL represented individual unions that represented certain skills or trades. You had electricians union, you had
Carpenters.
plumbers, steam fitters, and they were all in separate unions that together joined the American Federation of Laborers. There were other organizations. Of workers, of unions that also came about during this time period. The Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance, which was the union wing of the Socialist Labor Party, was created in 1895. It was created in opposition to the AFL because they, again, strategies, tactics, they didn't agree. They promised that they would not be affiliated with any capitalist party and not support any political actions except that of the Socialist Labor Party, as opposed to the AFL.
But hold on, there is a bright side of this. There is
Yes.
a group coming
They're
over
coming.
the hill now to change all of this and put everything to where it should be
And
in
we're-
one big happy
We're going to
basket.
hold you in suspense, and we're going to identify the station.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. And now we are going to have a word from our sponsor, Brighter Day.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
So thank you, Brighter Day, for sponsoring WRUU. If you are a corporation that would like to sponsor the
If your
station,
business
please listen
enjoys our
further.
programming,
So I can't hear any of this. Can you hear it?
Just one
diverse,
moment, folks.
vibrant radio programming. As a business partner, our listeners will know you support Savannah's only broad-based community radio station. Become a tower sponsor or underwriter. To check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Again, to check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUULP.
And thank you for staying with us. Your suspense is about to end when we tell you about another organization, another union that was founded, this time in 1905, which was a little different than the other ones that we have talked about.
Well, you mentioned that the unions up to that point had been basically individual trades or individual crafts. If
Yes.
I were an electrician, I was with this group. If I were a carpenter, I was in this group. So there was really no working together. So the situation arises when I was working in Phoenix. We were working on a construction site. My uncle owns a tile and marble company, and I was employed as a tile setter's helper. And so I'm standing there and believing wholeheartedly, not long back from Vietnam, in unions and in people working together and the power that unions have. And I see that the plasterers aren't getting their money, and so they go on strike. So I'm expecting all of us, we're going to have to pack up and leave. No. The only ones that had to leave was the plasterers.
Wow.
Everybody else stayed working. And that amazed me because
Yeah.
I don't call that solidarity of working people. And if I'm only going to associate with the people who do the same job I am, then I'm really not part of a labor unit. I am just working for myself or my little group. And so it really bothered me. I'm standing there and they're walking out, and we can't.
Right.
Well, you could have.
Yeah, but we'd be fined. They would fine us the.
Well, that's
So I was told.
ultimately that's the risk that people have to face now, right? Like they have to say, like, I mean,
Yeah.
we're ready to incur the consequences together. It just needs to be
Right.
people willing to actually do
Right.
that.
Well, I did have an advantage.
Not that I'm
Did it-
judging you for
Yeah.
that.
No, I actually
No,
should though. But
don't judge him.
that was my thing.
Right.
And I didn't have to fear because I wouldn't be fired. It was my uncle that owned the company, so I didn't have to worry about losing my job. But
Well, now I am
He wouldn't have
judging
been
you a little
happy. Yeah, he
Yes,
wouldn't have been
now you
happy.
But starting in 1905, you did have another option, the Industrial Workers of the World. So this organization came along and promoted the concept of one big union. All workers can belong to the IWW,
You
or
know-
as they were more affectionately known, the Wobblies.
There was another problem with most of the other unions. They were very racist in the fact that they didn't hire any ethnicity other than their own, basically. If you were Chinese or if you were black or indigenous or Hispanic, they wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot
women?
pole in those days. No women.
Right.
So, yeah. So the idea of this was, to me, again, a slap of working people, because working people, all of us are working people, no matter what race or nationality or whatever we are. So when you have this movement towards this separation, it weakens anything that you really have to put forth. Think of the power if we had all walked off that job site. We'd have crippled it. But it kept going.
Right.
So we actually had no power. We were very ineffective. And then the Wobblies come along, and they include everybody.
Yes.
Period. Doesn't matter who you are, you're in. If you're a working person, you're it.
That's right. And in fact, the other significant thing about the Wobblies was that they were not only dedicated to organizing on the job and improving conditions for the workers, but also the conditions in the community. So you look at what's called a business union, and they're really very singularly focused on the workers that they represent. And they will look for benefits for their particular workers, but the impact on the community is not part of their scope. The Wobblies, however, were very different in their focus, organizing again across gender, ethnic, and racial lines, and this was not a very popular thing at the time. And the other thing, organizing, I love this, organizing to win better conditions today and build a world with economic democracy tomorrow. Now, if this is the tomorrow they were thinking about, we have anything but economic democracy.
The Wobblies had quite a few statements when they started talking that were really revolutionary in itself for the day. I know we all know them. Phoenix, you probably know the one about an injury to one is an injury to all.
I've heard that.
That comes from the Wobblies.
Yes.
What is it? All for one and
all
one
for one
for
and
all.
One for all, yes. Solidarity forever.
Right. And solidarity, that's their big key
Yes,
word. People
that
have
was
to
a big
stick
key
together.
word.
Solidarity.
That's right. They're the two things right in there on their website: industrial unionism, which means they will organize everybody at a particular industry, regardless of the job you're doing, and solidarity unionism, based on the direct strength of the workers on the job, without regard to who they are and anything else. They believe in solidarity. They will stand with other unions, and they believe in standing together. They understand the power of many people, and we have talked about that on the show in other contexts. If you're out there doing an action where there may be a potential for arrest and there's 100 of you, well, 100 people can be rounded up and arrested. What if there were 1 million of you, 2 million of you? There's power in numbers, and the Wobblies truly understood that.
Yeah, they tried their best to pull everybody together, but I don't understand why it seems such an easy thing. It's an easy concept.
Yeah.
We stand together, we have a chance.
But propaganda is the great divider.
Oh, it is, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. That's right.
All right, what
I
would you
forgot about
say
that.
is propaganda now?
What would I say is
Yeah,
propaganda? That's a
with
very wide question.
You've got 30 seconds.
Okay, I would say propaganda is
Not
a method of using information to influence people's minds, whether it's real or not. It doesn't really matter. Propaganda can all be real, or it could all be lies. And there's definitely been a lot of anti-union, anti-labor, anti-socialist propaganda that have given people a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be in a union, or what it means to be an anti-capitalist organization, things like that, which I think has caused them. I think that's a big part of why they lost a lot of their success, especially y'all were talking about Haymarket, and we didn't really talk about the Black or Red Scare that happened, but that's a big problem that these kind of groups face, is that people had been led to believing very publicly that these sort of groups were dangerous. They were called terrorist groups and things like this, and so they were not able to keep and maintain strength as well as they would just on merit of having the interests of the people in heart.
And they certainly understood the concept of class warfare, that the workers were a class in warfare against the owners of the businesses, and they clearly represented the working class people, regardless of the jobs they did, regardless of who they were, their backgrounds, whatever. They rejected alliances with political parties, which is one strategy that clearly neither the AFL and then coming along later on the CIO did not do, as we well know today.
So they aligned themselves with, right now, one particular party, and it has not worked out to their benefit, because the condition of labor today, even 40 years ago, I have friends, that been members for a long time, whether it's the auto industry or the newspaper industry, they can tell you the conditions of the union now are a shadow of what they were then, not only just in terms of sheer numbers, which we see are non-existent almost, and the benefits that they've lost, even the benefits of their retirements that they put in, they're half of them are gone or depleted, and so it's a bad system for the working people in this country, and the propaganda generally comes from those who benefit the most from this division and putting it down, which would be
the rich.
Yeah. So it ultimately comes down to one thing: class warfare. That's it.
Right. And it's important to remember that at this time in history, the early 1900s, going on strike was not legal. There was no law that gave workers the right to strike. Therefore, it can be treated as an illegal action. Yet the Wobblies believed in direct action tactics. They rejected many of the things that unions do today: concessionary bargaining, prevalent no strike and management rights clauses that the current unions typically will agree to.
And they didn't ask the city for a permit.
No, and they did not ask the city for a permit. They knew that when they held an action, when they were out there in the street, that they, again, were putting themselves at risk. And many of the Wobblies spent time in jail, and
many died.
Many died as a result of their actions. And
I'm curious about, because I understand that at a lot of these rallies and demonstrations, just as we see today, police violence was used and people were arrested just by manner of being at a protest, essentially. But I'm curious what made striking illegal? Like, what is there? Like, how is going away from a private business something which could be justifiably punishable by law? I mean, obviously, I don't think there really is a justification, but, like, what was their justification for prosecuting anybody on that?
Well, you weren't just walking off the job. You were holding an action. You were out in the street. You were carrying signs. You may have been blocking roads.
Right.
Beating up scabs.
So that's what the thing I was saying. It's just more about the being at the protests. It wasn't actually legal just to not go to work.
Oh, I would imagine not.
The point was that it was not against the law, but there was no law to protect workers.
Right, they were criminalized. Yes,
right.
Of course.
Right.
As protesters still are today.
So, in fact, if you went out on strike,
we all know, right?
Yeah.
even if you called in sick, you had a sick out. What do we call it? The blue flu?
Blue flu or the red flu, or the fireman, whatever it is.
I love that, the red flu.
Yes, the red flu, the blue flu.
Got some of that.
So even if you just walked off your job, there was nothing to say that there couldn't be retaliation.
Right.
So, and whether that retaliation was losing your job, whether it was being fired on in the street for an illegal assemblage of people, whatever it was, there was certainly retaliation because, of course, the owner class were the people with the power, the people with the money.
Little known fact, that's why a lot of people for a long time, back then and today, cover their faces at these things so they don't get in trouble with their bosses.
That's exactly right.
Which is why it's illegal to cover your face now, because they want to see you in trouble.
Well, not in Georgia, it's because of the Klan, but everywhere else, yes.
Yeah, so one of the most famous Wobblies was Joe Hill, songwriter, itinerant laborer, union organizer.
Great songs.
Great songs, absolutely great songs. In fact, we did a quote from Joe Hill earlier, and there are songs written about him, which are great songs. He was convicted of one of the ways to take people out, to take troublemakers out, was to charge them with, give them a trumped up charge. So somebody's murdered, well, you're gonna put that charge on this agitator because you want to take them out.
Still works today, you know.
Still works today. That's that playbook. You know, if something works, you just keep doing it.
We have hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners in jail now for crimes they did not commit just because now they're Leonard Peltier and quite a few others, you know.
Imam Jamil.
Jamil.
Yes. So Joe Hill was convicted of murder in Utah, and on the eve of his execution, he said, "Don't waste time mourning, organize." He also was, it was told that he said, after I die, bring my body to the state line. I don't want to be caught dead in Utah. So he had a sense of humor, even as he was about to be executed.
That's some good gallows humor.
Yeah, that is
Pretty good.
That is good humor. So, moving forward, one of the things that the Wobblies understood was that war was not a good thing for working people. And as the lead up to World War I, the Wobblies definitely took a stand against the war. And at that point, anyone who took a stand against the war was considered committing an act of treason. And the Wobblies were certainly put in that position.
In fact, they could arrest you for speaking out against the war,
Yeah.
and you could be charged.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. That is fun.
American freedom of speech for you.
Yes, that is freedom of speech. Now, despite the incredible government brutality against the Wobblies to try to get rid of them, because they were really looking for system change. They were looking to bring the capitalists down. They were looking for a different system. They still exist today. In fact, some of us have just recently joined the Wobblies, and we're going to be at a Labor Day picnic representing the Wobblies on Sunday, and that should be very interesting because there was probably a lot of people out there who don't even realize that the Wobblies are still a viable union that could be out organizing workers.
In fact, if you go to our Facebook page, the address and information will be on there. We have to make an event page for this, so it's going to be interesting.
It will be.
And we're going to have support. We have a group who's in solidarity.
In solidarity.
Yeah, that's a good word, isn't it? Good
Yes.
Solidarity is going to be there working. They fully support the idea of working people and the Savannah Comrades. I'm
Yes,
gonna
the
say.
Savannah Comrades will be in solidarity with the Wobblies at the Central Labor Council picnic on Sunday.
Oh, they sound pretty cool.
Yes, they do
Yeah,
sound
they do
pretty
sound cool.
I like
That's
the
it.
sound of that.
I've known them for a while now.
Yeah, and they are, for the most part, they are pretty cool.
For the most part. It is hot out here. I mean, you got to give them a break. It can
That's
always
right.
be cool.
That's right. That's right. So all of this union movement, many, many, many strikes, some of which are better known than others, sort of the Haymarket Massacre. There were great railroad strikes, the Pullman strike. We came across this Cripple Creek miners' strike, notable because it was the only time in history when a state militia was called out in support of the striking workers, which will tell you all these other
Yeah,
strikes.
usually it's always the other way around,
That's right. The state militia was called out
as
to
in
put down the
Standing
strike.
Rock and whatever. Yeah.
And in fact, in one strike, and I'm not sure if I remember which one it was, the owners hired contractors to drop leftover bombs from World War II on the strikers.
One.
World War I.
Yeah, thank
World
you.
War I on
Those
the
are bigger
strikers.
bombs than two.
Yes, not two. World War I. The Wobblies do have the distinction of supporting a successful strike, the textile strike of 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Now, this was a strike of mostly women and immigrants and children. And the other unions looked at the Wobblies and said, "Oh, this is certainly doomed to failure. How can this group possibly be successful?" Well, part of the reason they were successful were some great strategies that they employed, but also because their cause was so moving. So one of the things that they did is they sent the children who were starving in Lawrence, Massachusetts, because the families were out on strike, to sympathetic homes in New York, Vermont, and New Jersey. So all of a sudden, the knowledge of the strike was spread quite far and wide. The other thing they did was this thing called a moving picket line. So
This was the first time.
yes,
Really?
it was illegal to gather outside of a building that you were striking. So the women came outside and said, "Oh, let's go for a walk." So it was a moving picket line.
That's
They
cool.
just walked around and around the
Yeah,
building.
round
I've
and
done that
round
a
and
few
round.
times.
And
In fact, that was the Wobblies' only success.
success.
Really. Yeah, everything else failed as
Right.
far as to achieve the goal, but it planted seeds that will never
absolutely,
be uprooted.
absolutely. And because this strike got such notoriety, hearings were held on the people learned about the shocking conditions in the textile factories, and it was referred to as the Bread and Roses strike. There's certainly been a lot of music written, there's movies, there's books about Bread and Roses. And at the victory party after the strike settlement, they sang the Internationale in several different languages, because remember, this was a strike. These were immigrants who worked in this factory.
Now, just in case you don't know, the Internationale is the international song of the working man. Every country. In fact, there are groups that gather where they have sung at the same time in 60 different languages, if you can imagine such a thing. And all of them united in this important song that they're together there, and that's
It's
good
pretty
thing.
amazing. And you could Google and find the Internationality sung in all these different languages, not by these people who struck, but obviously not by them. They didn't make it to the internet. But it is a very powerful song, and it was a very powerful strike in many ways. There were many, many strikes in our history where people died, and in fact, very often you will hear unions say, we fought and died to give you the weekend, to give you the 8-hour day. Well, we also learned a little bit about that, because even though these unions
It is in a way.
were powerful, even though these unions were not afraid, for the most part, particularly the Wobblies, to take action, it's ironic that we discovered who actually gave us the 8-hour day. And in fact, it was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford basically said that he would cut the standard workday to 8 hours and double his workers' pay. And theoretically, at least what I've heard, is he wanted people to be able to afford his cars, and perhaps by cutting the workday also use those cars.
Well, actually, he did that. He, to the scorn of the other manufacturers at the time, because they could only see ruin for taking care of the working man. That was something you just didn't do. They made people work 12 hours a day, and making just not even enough to really exist on, much like today in some ways.
Right.
But actually, the opposite occurred. Henry Ford's profits doubled.
Right.
So he didn't lose anything. He gained.
It is worth pointing out, too, that this is like people did still in these unions fight and die for these causes. It wasn't until decades and decades later that this was actually passed of unions and socialist organizers working for that.
It's highly doubtful that any of these reforms would have happened if it weren't for the workers standing up and demanding these rights. And
but these were the workers from the 1830s and 1840s that started this. This is even long before, half a century before the Wobblies came along, or more than that. And actually, it wasn't until 1935, I think it was.
Actually, 1938 was the Fair Labor Standards Act.
That's the only one that guaranteed the 8-hour workday.
So a lot of these labor activists did die to keep that fight alive up till that point.
Right.
Yes.
That is very true. And the other interesting thing I think about the Ford Motor Company action, and it might be a little hard for people to understand this today. It's hard for me to even remember. When once upon a time, there was actually a time where maybe there weren't more jobs than people, but there were a lot of jobs. And employers fought for employees, and they had to compete with each other to offer the kind of wage and benefit package to attract workers. I mean, today we shake our head, and it's hard to imagine those conditions.
I just want to bring up one thing about the Wobblies real quick. It just came up to mind. Something that a lot of people might not know is that Comrade Heather Heyer, that was killed in Charlottesville during that big alt-right rally, they were a member of the IWW also.
Okay, so the tactics...
No matter where we go, we see IWW flags now, whether it was in Washington for the J20
at the inauguration.
They still are very active politically, even though they don't necessarily have the labor power that they've had before.
Right, and that's really, really important. Thank you for bringing that up. That's really cool. So it was quite a few years after some of these actions that at the time of the New Deal, when some of these labor reforms became codified in law, and in fact, the 8-hour day, when it was initially part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, only applied to 700,000 workers. It was very limited in scope. And then we have the National Labor Relations Act, which was also New Deal, 1935, which we kind of talked about back and forth. Was it good for labor? Was it not good for labor? On one side, it legalized strikes, so you could no longer be arrested just simply for striking, but it gave very limited conditions upon which a strike was legal. It had to be for economic conditions or for unsafe conditions within the place where you worked. Those were the reasons why you could strike. If you struck for another reason, you could be charged with an illegal strike and face considerable penalties.
Yeah, even your union could be fined. That's why wildcat strikes are really kind of hard to get people to support.
Oh, what's a wildcat strike?
What is? You know what? It's as good as I do.
Oh, wait, I do know that.
Oh, you do know.
Oh, wait.
So wildcat strikes are a great way to explain it is how that term came about, I guess. Essentially, folks was it in France? I believe where the term first started for the wildcat strikes, I believe. Mm. So there were strikes that they didn't have a board approval or a large union support. It was just the workers saying, we're going on strike until this gets rectified. And there's a mascot for them that's like a black cat, because apparently a black cat kept hanging around with them and supporting the strike. But wildcat, so they're called wildcat strikes, but it's a tactic which has been used for a long time now, which involves skipping the union process and just going straight to the workers' power. Straight
to the street, right. It also limited what workers could do. You couldn't just sit down on the job and refuse to work, and you couldn't do any kind of acts of sabotage.
You know, the one thing, this is really what we wanted was a discussion of the conditions also of labor today. Labor during the New Deal and after World War II, did see a rise in benefits and a rise because so much had to be redone now, rebuilt. And so we saw that, but the power now is gone. I mean, you see everything stripped away bit by bit by bit by bit. And now, what was it we said about the unions? You could put 100,000 people on the street, or 300,000, right. And now you'd be lucky to get 9 come to a picnic. So it's kind of,
or you could fit them in a telephone booth,
telephone
and
booth.
still have room to make a call.
And it's really sad. Yeah, it's really sad because
it is very sad. It is very sad. So, with the little bit of time that we have left, we feel like we need to ask these questions. What emasculated the unions? Was it a retreat from their radicalism? Was it a retreat from active organizing, going after members? Was it a lack of solidarity? A focus on electoral politics versus direct action? A rise of the capitalist state? Was it all of the above or none of the above? So this is kind of our open discussion piece, and we would love to hear from all of you who are listening what your ideas are.
Yeah, well, you know, the unions themselves are trying to get some sense of who they are, but they really need to take stock of who they're against. See, the Wobblies understood. They were against the wage system, they were against capitalism, they understood where the troubles really came from. So they weren't attacking shadows like, I need 8 hours and no more. They used that, but their ultimate goal was that the workers should control things, control the places where, because those rich people are making money off your back.
All power to the people,
all
as
power
they
to
said.
the people, yes.
And surely the issue is solidarity, which we have talked a lot about. So there was once a time when if a union went out on strike, other unions would join the action. Maybe they wouldn't strike, but they would be out in the street with their fellow brothers and sisters. They understood about an injury to one is an injury to all. They stood in solidarity. Again, there's power in numbers, and they were out there.
To this day, I have never crossed a picket line. I don't care who puts it up. I am not crossing that picket line.
I don't even like to use the machines at Kroger.
That's
I try to support the workers.
I won't use it for that reason. I'll stand in line for an hour with 2 items rather than go through those machines, because those machines are taking... Well, that's the problem we have with industrial... We won't get into that.
That's a whole other show.
You got that right.
A whole other show. And was there was the focus on electoral politics? I mean, we don't have much time left, and that could be a show in and of itself. when unions became,
Pawns of political
aligned with
parties.
pawns of the electoral system.
Yeah, we spent 3 days putting this together and thinking, well, we can cover a show. We haven't even gone through half of it. Not
No,
even half of it.
There's so much more we could talk about, and we will.
Okay.
So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for
That's
listening
it.
to Voices Resistance. Next week, in advance of 9/11.